are expecting something special today. Man, how many of you were actually listening and paying attention to the words of that song that you just sang? Give me the words to speak to tell the nations. You can't even convince your neighbor right now. And yet he's expecting us to tell the nations. So obviously there's got to be a change. There's a time for us to be more vocal, to be able to proclaim it and actually mean it. In fact, I loved the last part of the song because it says that you're going to sing until the whole earth shakes. We're quite a ways away from that. Amen? How many of you are ready to see that begin to happen? You remember that? Thank you. Hallelujah. Amen. Praise his name. He's holy and he's worthy to be praised. You know, Yeshua told his disciples that if they didn't cry out, that the rocks were going to cry out. So either way, he's going to get the praise that he deserves. Do you realize that? The question becomes, do we get to be a part of that? Do we get the benefit of being one that was willing to praise him in the midst of everything that was going on? Or are we going to be one of the ones that says those rocks had to cry out because we weren't willing to? That's powerful. Our words are powerful. Give us the words to speak. Amen. You know, it's quite funny because that's actually the name of this week's Torah portion. It has everything to do with the words that we speak. Words are powerful. The title of this week's Torah portion is Emor. And I was joking with the young lady before the service started because there's a special young lady in here this afternoon that her nickname is Emor, Miss Cecily. And I believe if anyone that knows her, you know that she's got words to say, and those words are important. I believe of all the individuals in here, she's probably one of those that understands the power of words. And she understands the power of the word of Yahweh. And so before we begin, I told her I was going to dedicate this teaching to her this afternoon. And so if you don't like what I have to say, you can take it up with her. No, I'm just kidding. How many of you realize that we're in a very special time frame in the calendar of Yahweh? We've finished the beginning of the spring feast. We went through Passover. We made it by the skin of our teeth through the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You're still here. You're still standing. But now we find we're in the midst of this process. It's known as the counting of the Omer. There's a counting of 50 days, 7 Sabbaths leading up to Shavuot, when the word of Yahweh, his words, were given. How many of you realize it seems as if these last few weeks, maybe there's been some things that have been happening that just, man, it rubs your fur the wrong way. It seems like people just are trying to push your buttons. It's frustrating. It's annoying. It's aggravating. And I started thinking, my goodness, in fact, I made the statement, I don't know why I've been so frustrated these last few days. And then I remembered, no wonder, it's the counting of the Omer. This is a time of preparation. It's a time of the heat being turned up. It's a purification process. We find that we're redeemed at Passover. He brings us out, but now he's got a group of individuals that have been entrenched in all kinds of stuff, that haven't been walking the way they're supposed to, that haven't been immersing themselves in the word of Yahweh like we need to. And so he gives them 50 days. He gives us this time frame of the counting of the Omer to be prepared so that when we meet him at Shavuot, when he's about to pour out his word and his power upon the people, we can be ready. And that's what these 50 days are for. So now we can understand when all these things are happening, when things begin to push our buttons and things begin to get on our nerves and it's things that are frustrating, we're being reminded this is a cleansing process. This is a purification. All this has got to go so that at Shavuot this can be put in. Amen. Wow. Y'all are really excited. The title of this portion, as we've already mentioned, Emor, it's translated as say or speak. How many of you read it? You'll know that it covers Leviticus chapter 21, verse 1 through chapter 24, verse 23. It has a most famous chapter in it, Leviticus 23. The calendar of Yahweh, his feasts and festivals are right here in the middle of some other laws that really don't catch our attention as fast. We find that this portion starts off with a specific set of commandments or laws that specifically are commanded for the priests. Now, our tendency, being the obedient children that we are, immediately realize, well, this is for the priests, the sons of Aaron. I don't have to do that. Woo! Those are a few that I can just disregard, not pay attention to, because I'm not a priest. There's no tabernacle, no temple, and there isn't anyone that's functioning in this role. And so immediately there's a sigh of relief. We don't want to be overachievers, right? Let's not get too antsy with this. And yet we find that there kind of becomes a little chink, if you will, in our reasoning when we get to the Brit Hadashah, to the New Testament. Because in the book of Revelation, in chapter 5, verse 10, Yeshua makes a statement that he has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. In fact, just because he knows you got to have two witnesses, you'll find that this is said multiple times. So again and again, you're reminded the whole purpose of what he's doing, the work that he's doing among the bodies, is so you can be kings and priests, so you can rule and reign with him. It would seem then that we need to pay attention to what it means to be a priest. And some would argue, well, this is talking about the millennial kingdom when it's being set up, and then we're going to rule and reign with him upon the earth. But do you think that if we began to put it into practice now, that it might make a difference? Because in this verse, it seems to be pointing towards the fact that our ability to have dominion, our ability to rule and reign and actually do what Adam and Eve were commanded to subdue, to have dominion, that it is hinging upon how we function in this role of kings and priests. In fact, when you look at this word in the Greek here, this word for reign, my Greek's worse than my Hebrew, so we're just going to skip over that Greek word. We're going to look at the meaning. It means to exercise the highest influence or control, kingly power, to reign. But it comes from a root that means a stepping, a walking, that with which one steps, the foot. In other words, our ability to function as priests in the earth affects the way we walk. It affects our way of life. In other words, this begins to affect every aspect of our lives. We try to do the argument, we're not priests, we're not of the line of the Levites, and yet we're reminded that the whole nation of Israel was called to be a kingdom of priests, weren't they? We find that we're reminded that our own bodies, we're told, are a temple. So if this is a temple, then who's the priest? Who's making sure this temple's operating the way it should be? In our houses, who's the priest of the household? Who's inspecting the house, making sure the house operates as the tabernacle as it should be? So we find that it begins to get more personal and more personal and more personal, to the point that we're reminded the way we handle the role of the priest, the way we function in our priestly duties, it affects every aspect of our lives. It affects our daily life. It affects our walk. That means then that when we come across portions like this, it's beginning to deal specifically with commandments to the priests. If we just skim over it and ignore it, we've done ourselves a great disservice, haven't we? Because there's some principles that are being established in these Torah portions that are teaching you and I how to rule, how to have dominion, how to be able to subdue, how to rule and reign with him. How many of you want to be able to do that? Some of you, okay. Well, let's look at this, because hopefully as we continue to delve into this, there's going to be some excitement, some stirring that begins to happen, a waking up, a shaking, as he begins to reveal to us what he has in store. It was interesting to me that as I begin to look at this week's Torah portion, you'll find that there's a specific number that's kind of hidden. It's not really seen on the surface, but it shows up several times if you know where to look for it, and it's the number 7. As I begin to look at this Torah portion, I realize it is the 7th parsha of the book of Leviticus, or Vayikra. It also so happens, if you were paying attention, this Torah portion starts in the 21st chapter. Well, if you're good at math, you know that 21 is 7 times 3, 7, 7, 7. The first verse of this particular portion has 56 letters in the Hebrew, 7 times 8. And the value of the title of the portion, Emor, has a gematria, or numerical value of 241. 2, 4 plus 1. 2 and 4 and 1 is 7. So once again, we see the number 7, 7, 7, 7. And there's many that would say, that has nothing to do with this. It's not important. That's just something that's been put there. Man divided the chapters. Man divided the portions. And yet, instead of so quickly dismissing it, let's just take a look. Does this number 7 have something to do with our role as a priest? What does it mean? Well, the number 7 is the number that's symbolic of covenant. In fact, to seven oneself means to enter into a covenant, doesn't it? In fact, the word in the Hebrew for 7 and the word for cutting a covenant, to 7ing oneself, they're the same roots, they're the same words. The number 7 can also refer to something that's perfect, something that's complete, perfection and completion. We find as we continue to look at this number 7, because remember, we're looking at what is the role of the priest? How do we function as a priest in our own lives, in our own households? What's expected of you and I? Well, we find that this number 7 is connected with the Hebrew letter Zion. Zion is the 7th letter. The Zion, how many of you know what it's a picture of? It's a picture of a sword or a weapon. And we understand that later we're told that Yahweh also has a sword. His word, the Torah, is a sharp two-edged sword. And this word Zion can mean to cut. And so it seems that before we ever get started, he's beginning to lay a foundation. There's something to do with the role of the priest that has to do with knowing how to wield the sword, knowing how to properly use his word, the Torah. Interestingly, though, not only does this word mean to cut, but the word Zion itself comes from a root that means sustenance, nourishment. And so when we begin to tie all this together, we find that this number 7 seems to be teaching us and reminding us that for you and I, if we're going to be operating as priests, that in order for us to be sustained, in order for us to be nourished, in other words, in order for the body to be able to grow and to continue to grow and to be healthy, that it requires some things to be cut off. It requires the sword to come into play. It requires a circumcision of the body. And we find that it's only by coming into contact with this sword, with this weapon that cuts, that then we're able to walk this covenant out. That then we're able to perfect it, to complete it, to actually fulfill our end of the bargain. Because remember, a covenant's a two-way street, isn't it? It's not just about what he's going to do, but it's about responsibilities that you and I have. And it seems as if that if we want to be functioning in the role of the priest, if we want to be one that's able to have dominion, and it's not talking about ruling over someone else, subjugating them and making them lower so you look better, but it's dealing with being able to rule and have dominion over your own flesh, being able to rule and have dominion in your household so that it's lining up to what the Torah says it should be, being able to have effect on your community, outside of the four walls, being able to affect the nation. Give me the words to tell the nation, have an effect upon everyone that's around you, and it becomes a ripple effect. And we find that this happens when we allow the sword of his word to begin to circumcise our own hearts, when we learn how to use it. It seems like quite a simple concept, doesn't it? And yet when we look around, how much of an effect are we really having? This becomes a very personal inspection, these words that he's speaking to those that would be the priests, those that would wait upon him, those that would be in this relationship with him, functioning and serving in his tabernacle. It was all about an introspection first. What kind of effect are they having on the community, on their household? And we find that it seems as if we're being admonished before we ever delve into the specific rules and the specific laws. We're being admonished that we need to learn how to properly use the sword. You realize this is a sharp two-edged sword. If I don't know how to properly use this, I might injure myself. And not only might I injure myself, but I may injure people that are around me. You don't give a loaded weapon to a 3-year-old that has no idea what to do with it, because they may not injure themselves, but they most likely, there's going to be an effect around them, not for the good. And so we find that he's reminding us, if you're going to be functioning as a priest in your own life, in your own household, in the community, you're having an effect. There's a ripple effect. There's consequences. There's changes that are taking place. We need to know how to handle properly the word, properly the sword, lest we do more damage than good. Some of us have seen firsthand the effects of what happens when we don't know what we're doing, haven't we? It doesn't end well, does it? Let's look at Leviticus chapter 21, verse 1. It says, "And Yahweh said unto Moshe, Speak, Emor, unto the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say unto them, There shall none be defiled for the dead among his people." And we find that he continues to go on and he begins to list some very specific areas that the priest, you're not allowed to do this, or you shouldn't do this. When you do these things, you're going to disqualify yourself. And we find that in verse 6, it seems to be the whole point of why these laws are being given. In verse 6, he tells them they shall be holy unto their Elohim. In other words, these commandments are being given to you so that you can be holy and not profane the name of Yahweh. For the offerings of Yahweh made by fire and the bread of their Elohim they do offer. Therefore they shall be holy. So we find that we could take this same idea and put it in our own lives, can't we? He expects us to be a holy people. He expects us to be walking in such a manner that we're not profaning his name. He expects us to be able to offer up this living sacrifice in such a way that it doesn't profane his tabernacle. And yet we're reminded, if we don't understand the parameters, if we don't understand the commandments, the rules, then we won't know what profanes his name. Then we won't know what's holy or what's unholy. And that's why these become very important. Let's look at this word speak here. It's interesting because it's actually used 3 times in this verse, this term Emor. It comes from the root Emor, Strong's number 559, and it means to say, to speak, to utter, to bear forth, or to bring to light. It can also refer to what's being communicated by a person's actions along with his words. A lot of times we try to separate these two, don't we? Listen to what I'm saying, but don't watch what I'm doing. But yet we find that this term speak, Emor, the words that are coming forth, the words that are powerful, he's reminding us that not only is it going to be what's coming out of our mouth, but what we're doing, our lifestyle, the way we're walking, is going to proclaim whether we're a fit priest or not. Our actions sometimes will speak louder than words. Let's break down this word, Emor, because we understand that the sword that he's trying to teach us to use is his word. Is it any wonder it's found in a portion translated as say? It's all about the words that we're speaking. Are we speaking forth and using the word, the sword, properly or not? This word speak is spelled Aleph Mem Resh, Emor. If you break it apart, you'll find that the first part is the Aleph Mem. And if you've been in Hebrew class, this should be a very familiar word for you. Aleph Mem forms the word Im. It means mother. Once again, we find that it's a reminder that what we're speaking is birthing something. It's mothering. These words are being mothered. They're being birthed into existence. They're being brought forth. Our words are powerful. It also becomes a reminder, what does the mother do? The mother is the womb. She houses the seed. And so we are reminded that our words that are coming forth, they've been housed inside of us. They've been wombed within us. In other words, from the heart, the mouth speaks. And so we begin to see these connections. There's something very powerful that happens when we choose to birth these words, when we release them, when we bring them forth. The Aleph Mem, though, can also form a word, Strong's number 518, Im, which can mean if, when, whenever. This word is used to introduce conditional statements, something that's capable of being fulfilled in everyday settings. And so it seems as if when we see this term Emor, there's some conditions that are being outlined, some parameters here. When or if we speak. The majority of us, it's when we speak, not if we speak. It's not usually a question. Sooner or later, it's going to come out. So when we speak, we're reminded something's being birthed. Something's being brought forth. And in the role of a priest, in the role of one that's responsible for taking care of this tabernacle, we're being reminded it's important to guard what we allow to be brought forth. We control what we birth. We control what we bring forth. Let's look at the second part of this term, Emor. It's spelled Mem Resh is the second root on the end of this word. It forms the word meaning mar or bitter. We know that it's a reference to the bitter waters of Numbers chapter 5. If you're not familiar with it, we know that in Numbers chapter 5, there's a specific ordeal that's outlined that the priest is in charge of administering. When a woman was accused of adultery, she's brought before the priest and she's made to drink the mar, ma'im, the bitter waters. And it's the priest's responsibility to make these waters and to administer these waters. It comes from the root marar, meaning to be bitter, to be strong, or to strengthen. And so we begin to see there's these connections between the role of the priests and the words administering these waters. The interesting thing, though, is that not only do we see this connection with the bitter waters, but when we continue to look at this word Emor, to speak, to bring forth words, it has a numerical value of 241. Well, that's the same value as the Hebrew word ha-kior. It means the laver. It refers to the brazen laver in the tabernacle. Once again, a source of waters. How many of you realize that at the brazen laver, when they first would enter into the tabernacle courtyard, the immediate first thing is the brazen laver. The priests daily had to go to the brazen laver to wash themselves, to look into the waters. An inspection was required of themselves first before they could begin their priestly duties. How many of you remember that the brazen laver was made from the mirrors of the ladies of Israel? When they looked into the waters, they were inspecting themselves. They were seeing any blemish, any spot that would hinder them from operating as a priest. Do you realize it's a picture as well of his word? Every day we're commanded to come and to look into the waters, to gaze into the mirror to see, is there any blemish? Is there something that's going to hinder me from operating in the role of a priest? Is there something that's going to be a blemish upon me that's going to call into question my authority in this house? So as we begin to look at this, we find that whatever we as priests choose to vocalize, whatever we speak forth, whatever we release, it's powerful, isn't it? We find that it can either administer the bitter waters or it can represent the cleansing waters of the brazen laver to the body in order to strengthen one another. Immediately we think, well, there you go. We need to get rid of the bitter waters and just focus on the waters of the laver, the water that cleanses. And yet we find that in the Torah specifically, the priests were in charge of both, weren't they? They're in charge of the bitter waters, administering them, and they're in charge of the brazen laver waters, the cleansing waters, the waters that would cleanse in the ceremonies that would take place in the tabernacle. So obviously, before we disregard when we find that we're being reminded, there's a balance that's being set up, isn't there? Both waters are necessary, obviously, or Yahweh wouldn't have given the priest the charge of them. Both the bitter waters are needed and the waters that would cleanse. And we find that the role of the priest was to handle both of them, to know when which one was needed, to properly administer both types of waters. With this understanding, now we can look back at that number 7, the Zion, the weapon, the sword. And we can begin to understand that whatever we choose to cut off, we must ask the question, if we're going to administer these bitter waters, something that's going to cut something off, if we're going to use the sword to cut, is it something that's nourishing the body? Is it something that's strengthening the body, or is it hindering it? When we cut this, is it going to hinder or is it going to nourish? When we choose to not cut something off, when we choose to not circumcise it, when we allow it to continue in the body, we have to ask the question, is it hindering the body or is it sustaining? Is it nourishing? Is it helping the body to grow? And we find the role of the priest was always, no matter what the situation, to be able to look and discern, does this need to be removed or does it need to stay? Is it going to hinder the entire body and infect the holiness of the camp? Or is it not? Does it need to be removed or is it allowed to stay? We find this becomes a very important question, doesn't it? And we find that this is an area that today, as a body of believers, we have not understood and we haven't administered properly, have we? We find that we've been very unbalanced. The pendulum has swung from one end to the other. We find that people have been destroyed because of our words. We become Torah police, Torah terrorists, and we cut and we destroy people's lives. And we don't properly administer the waters. And instead of being something that would allow the body to grow, allow the body to be nourished by trimming it, instead it's just cut to the ground. It's demolished and it's destroyed. And then we find that we get to the opposite end of the spectrum. All kinds of junk's allowed in the house, isn't it? No one's willing to say anything. Shh, don't judge lest you be judged. We find that no one wants to say anything because the minute they speak out and say something, all of a sudden, they're looking at you. And because we're not willing to deal with our own lives and our own houses, we better not say anything about that person because then they're going to be looking at me. And we find that we're not willing to shake the boat. We're not willing to rock the boat. We don't want to come under scrutiny. And so all manner of stuff is allowed in the house. And guess what? Because we didn't trim, because we didn't prune, because we didn't circumcise, because we didn't set a standard, the house is hindered anyway. The house is destroyed anyway. The house is once again unholy, unfit. And our role as priests now comes into question. And so we find that these Torah portions are teaching us a balance. Both are needed. Circumcision is required. Things have to be cut off. Things have to be dealt with. But yet, we also find that there's a cleansing that must take place. We find that both are necessary. And Yahweh is very particular on when to use which waters, how to use the sword, how to use it so that things aren't destroyed, but allowed to be nourished, to grow, to be sustained. It's interesting because in this particular Torah portion, once you get towards the end, it closes with a very well-known law. It closes out with the law of measure for measure. Mida keneged midah. And we find that this law, measure for measure, the way you measure it out is the way it's going to be measured back to you, becomes the framework of how to administer these laws, of how to administer these waters, of how to use the sword, measure for measure. And we find that a lot of times when we put this into practice, well, we're not really willing to mete out anything, are we? Because we don't want anything measured back to us. I'll leave you alone and you leave me alone, and then we're good. And yet we're being reminded that there's a specific way, measure for measure. The point of this law was to remind you that if the Torah becomes the measure, then you measure it out according to the Torah, then it's going to be measured back to you according to the Torah, and then there shouldn't be a problem, should there? Because the Torah is the standard. We all agree on the standard. We're all measuring it out, measure by measure, understanding that I judge you according to this and you judge me according to this, and we're following the guidelines that we've been given. We're balanced. The house isn't defiled because we've allowed everything to come in, and the house isn't destroyed because we became Torah terrorists and cut everything off. Measure for measure. In Leviticus 24, verse 19 through verse 20, this is where we get this midah keneged midah, measure for measure. It says, and if a man cause a blemish in his neighbor, as he hath done, so shall it be done to him. Breach for breach, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he hath caused a blemish in a man, so shall it be done to him again. Do you realize that if this were put into practice, there would be a lot less going on in the house, because you would understand that instead of spending so much time focusing on another, I better focus on myself, because it's going to be measured back to me. If I do this to you, it's going to happen to me. And so we find that we're reminded, what's the first order of duty for the priest? Go to the laver. Inspect yourself. And then only upon being cleansed ourselves can we then in turn, now let's look at the community. Now let's look at the house. Now let's begin to administer this and cause the house to be nourished, to sustain, to grow. Let's look at this word for blemish. If a man causes a blemish in his neighbor, so shall it be done to him. Blemish here is Strong's number 3971, ma'um, and it means a blemish, a spot, a defect. The interesting thing, though, is that it's used specifically to describe blemishes that would prevent one from functioning in the role of a priest. At the beginning of this Torah portion, in chapter 21, verse 17, he begins to talk about certain blemishes. If these are found among the line of Aaron, among the Levites, they cannot function in the role of a priest, these particular ma'um, these blemishes. So we find that then, really, we cannot put this into practice, this measure for measure, outside of the idea of how it means to operate as a priest. We find that if a priest had these blemishes, these ma'um, these defects, these spots, that we're told here in Leviticus 21 in this Torah portion, that because of these blemishes, they would not be allowed to offer the bread of Elohim. The blemished priest could eat it, but he couldn't offer it. And when I saw that, I thought, well, what's the difference? He can't approach the altar and he can't offer the bread to Yahweh, but he's still allowed to dwell in the tabernacle and to eat this bread. In fact, he's commanded. You'll find that in these verses, it's repeated. The emphasis seems to be on this idea of the bread of Elohim. This is why you have to be holy. This is why you're not to profane my name, because you offer the bread. If you are blemished, if you have profaned my name, then you can't offer the bread, but you will eat the bread. Could this be a clue then of how we're supposed to deal with blemishes the proper way? Could this be giving us a clue as if we're priests and we have a blemish because we didn't understand how to operate in the past? We've messed up. Then could this be a clue as to how we're to rectify that? Of how we're to correct this? We can't offer the bread, but we're allowed to eat it. Well, we understand that lechem, bread, it's symbolic of the Torah, isn't it? In fact, the Messiah makes the statement, he's the bread of life. He's the word made flesh. We understand this is our daily bread. Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of Yahweh. Let's look at the word for offer. We're not allowed to offer the bread if we're blemished. The word offer here is karab, and it means to come near, to approach, to draw near, and it's dealing with the idea of drawing near in an intimate relationship. We're not allowed to draw near into intimacy with Yahweh if we've caused a blemish in another, or if we have a blemish ourselves. In other words, my relationship with Yahweh is affected by my relationship with you. If I'm spending my time causing a blemish in any one of you, then in return, a blemish will happen to me. And when I have a blemish, I can't draw near to him. And so we find that he's beginning to put things in perspective. If we have a blemish, our relationship with him now is put into jeopardy. We're not able to draw near. This word karab, it's spelled kuf resh beit. Well, it was interesting to me because these same letters rearranged form the word bakar. But because the way the Hebrew language works, each letter being a picture, then these become cognates. They're spelled with the same letters. There's a similar picture that's being shown in these words. The word bakar is spelled beit kuf resh. It's Strong's number 1239, and it means to seek, to inquire, to consider, or to look for. It's first used to describe how the priest would inspect someone to see whether they were clean or unclean. Remember all these chapters that deal with the leprosy and the spots and someone that's unclean and someone that has an issue, and they have to come before the priest, and he has to look at it. He has to inspect it to see whether is it clean or is it not clean. It's the word bakar. And yet we find this is connected to the very thing that the blemished priest is unable to do. The blemished priest is unable to offer up the bread. The word offer, karab, this word seek, to look at, to inspect something, bakar. Could it be then that if we ourselves have a blemish, we're denied the right to inspect others, which is the duty of the priest? We find that we're being reminded that if we have a blemish and we're a priest, there's an indicator that something's wrong. Because when we came into the tabernacle, the first thing we should have done is went to the brazen laver, inspected ourselves in the mirror, cleansed ourselves with the waters. That's supposed to take care of any blemishes that we might have. So to be a priest with a blemish was an indicator that obviously we weren't willing to take those same waters and apply it to ourselves. And so if I'm not willing to take these same waters and apply it first to myself, how can I be qualified to apply these waters to you? How can I be qualified if I'm not able to inspect myself to inspect you? And so our role as a priest comes into question. We find that when we're not willing to circumcise our own hearts, we're not fit to circumcise anyone else's. He will always make you do it first. It begins personal. This tabernacle will line up. Then the household, your family tabernacle will line up. And then and only then can we begin to stretch out, broaden the stakes of our tent, broaden the influence. Only then can we begin to affect others around us when we first deal with this one. In fact, in the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, Yeshua said it this way. And in fact, he repeats it several different ways in the Gospels. In Luke chapter 6, verse 41, he says, "And why beholdest thou the speck that is in thy brother's eye, but perceivest not the beam that is in thine own eye?" A lot of times we take this and say, see, you can't judge me. You can't inspect me. And yet we miss the point. The point was you have a beam in your eye. Why are you worried about the speck in his? You've missed the point. Get the beam out of your own eye, and then you can probably see his speck better, and he might take your words better as well. Line up first yourself, and then we can be used as a vessel to help others. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. the word for bread, because it seems to all be circling around this idea of the bread. You have to be holy. You can't profane my name because you offer the bread. If you're blemished, you can't offer the bread, but you can eat the bread. The word bread is lechem. It's Strong's number 3899, and it means bread or food or grain. But the interesting thing is that it comes from the root lakam, which means to fight, to do battle, to make war. Remember earlier we talked about the letter Zion. It's the sword, to cut. The same idea, making war, but yet it comes from a root meaning to nourish, to sustain. It's the same thing here in the word lechem, bread. Bread is something that nourishes. It's something that sustains you. It's food for your body, yet it's coming from a root that has this idea of to make war, to fight, to do battle. Could it be that when we improperly do battle and make war, when we improperly use the Zion, use the sword, when we're not careful with our words and we end up cutting others because we didn't understand, we didn't follow the parameters, the guidelines, that this then is what causes blemishes in the body? And instead of causing the body to be sustained, to be nourished, to grow, we instead cause it to be hindered. We instead cause it to be something that's taking steps backwards instead of going forwards. And we find that if we do this, it seems to then be what prevents us from functioning in the role of priests. This causes us to be unable to draw near to Yahweh, improperly wielding the sword. And yet we find that these particular priests, they're blemished, they can't offer it. They've obviously handled it wrong in the past, so now they're not allowed to handle it. But yet they're told that they're still allowed to eat the bread. Let's look at this word for eat. The word eat in Hebrew is Strong's number 398, a call, and it means to eat, to devour, to burn up, to feed. It's interesting because when you begin to look at this term, a call, you'll find that it's used as a Hebrew idiom, and it refers to eat up space. And it's meaning that when space is eat up, it's laying claim to that space. It's claiming it. It's taking over. It's filling up the space. When we break this word apart, a call, we find that it's spelled Aleph, Kaf, Lamed. The letter Aleph as a prefix means I will. And the Kaf, Lamed means complete, to be perfect, to be finished. So we find the definition that's being proclaimed when they're told, eat the bread, they're being reminded that if you'll eat this bread, if you will put this bread in, I will complete you. In other words, the areas that you've been lacking in, the blemishes that you have that are not perfected, that are not up to standard, that are preventing you from operating as a priest, I'll complete you. I'll perfect that. I'll fix those blemishes. Because when you put the word in, when you eat the bread, it's going to claim space. It's going to begin to devour the things, those blemishes, those things that were caused you to be unclean, unfit to be a priest. It's going to eat it up. It's going to be a fire that begins to burn on the inside of you. And so we find that when we choose to eat the bread, the word, the Torah, the lechem, this is what makes us complete again. It removes the blemishes. It claims the space within us. And now, all of a sudden, when we do this, if we're obedient to put it in, then we find that there's a change or something that changes. We're completed, we're made perfect. Not in the sense that we're never going to fail, but in the sense of now the blemishes have been dealt with and we can be restored. We've messed up in the past. We haven't functioned as the priest like we should have. We've mishandled the sword. We've mishandled the administering of these waters. Our words were not watched. We weren't careful. And yet we're reminded if you'll put his word in, if you'll eat the bread, then you can again function in the role of a priest. You can be restored. You can once again bring balance back into the house. In fact, these same letters that form the word akal, to eat, also form the word kala, which means to restrict, to restrain, to withhold, and it can refer specifically to restraining one's lips or speech. In other words, when you eat the bread, it will teach you how to tame your tongue. We're told in the book of James that this is a most unruly member, isn't it? In fact, it has the potential to set on fire all of creation. It can devour, it can destroy. Life and death are in the power of the tongue. the Emor, the words that we speak are powerful. And yet we're reminded that if you'll put the lechem in, if you'll put the bread in, it's from the heart that the mouth speaks. So that means if I'm putting this in and it's laying claim to this space, then what's coming out is going to change, isn't it? Because it's coming from what I put in. And so if I put the word in, then it's the word that comes out. And his word is a sharp two-edged sword. It may cut, it may devour, it may burn up, but it becomes a holy fire that cleanses. And it's not me judging from my own flesh with a beam in my eye, but instead it's me administering the waters in the role of the priest, just being a vessel, allowing him to be used, allowing me to be used by him. It seems then that it's only by consuming the bread, putting in his word, that we learn how to control or restrain our speech, our words. In other words, it's teaching you how to properly use the Zion, how to properly use the sword. It enables our words to be something that nourishes instead of destroys. And this is quite important, isn't it? Because it's the role of the priests to administer both the bitter waters and the cleansing waters. If the priests can't do it, then who will? If we can't function like we're supposed to, like we've been called to, then what hope does the rest of the house have? If we can't learn how to discern, how to administer both these waters, how to be mature enough to deal with issues in the camp, then how are we going to deal when it gets even more, the heat gets turned up? When it gets even more important that we function as a body, the body's nourished and grows and is able to walk this out. It's all about us learning how to operate in the role of the priest now. You realize that the tabernacle was in the very center of the camp of Israel, wasn't it? The tabernacle became the nucleus of the entire camp of Israel. And it was within the tabernacle, the way that the priests were operating, serving Yahweh, they became a shadow picture, a teaching tool for the rest of the entire camp of how they were to act. If the priests got it wrong, what would be the state of the entire camp of Israel? You see, it was a very important cycle. They had to operate holy, be holy before Yahweh, not profane his name. Teach the rest of the camp how to be holy. They were charged with this. And with this responsibility came the fact that they were in charge of administering both these waters to make sure the camp stayed within the guidelines, to make sure the camp kept the commandments and was walking holy as a group, as a whole entity before Yahweh. So we find then that we're charged with diminishing both these waters. This becomes the reason why the one with the blemish is not allowed to offer the bread, but instead must eat it. I'm not fit to inspect or judge another until I've allowed the bread, the word, to be placed in me and judge me first. My heart first must be circumcised before I can ever, in turn, circumcise another. We find that by doing so, when it comes time to inspect another in the role of the priest, it's no longer our personal opinion that we're delivering, but instead we're proclaiming the Torah. And it's the Torah that's spoken forth, and it's the Torah that then discerns what needs to be cut, what needs to be allowed to stay, what needs to be removed from hindering, and what needs to be nourished and continue to grow. Now let's look at the next part of this verse. Measure for measure. If I cause a blemish in you, a blemish will be caused in me. Breach for breach. The word breach here is Strong's number 7667, shaber. And it means a breaking, a fracture, a crushing, a breach. Once again, though, it's connected to the role of the priests. The same term is used in Leviticus 21 here in this Torah portion to describe a fracture of the foot or the hand that would disqualify one from functioning as a priest. Specifically, it was referring to the feet or hands being broken. Notice once again, how do we walk? With our feet. If our feet are broken, then we are not able to walk. We find that these commandments, you functioning as the role of the priest, it has everything to do with your daily walk, your lifestyle, the way you live, the way you're walking out these commandments, walking out the word. It's interesting because when we look at this measure for measure, each part of it, once again, always is pointing us back to the role of the priests. The priests had to understand this principle. This was the whole basis of how to function, measure for measure, learning how to judge the body. That's what they're charged with. They were responsible for inspecting them. They were responsible for making sure the house was clean, holy, not profaning the name of Yahweh. And yet we find that how we handle these areas can disqualify us as a priest. How we treat each other affects how we're operating as a priest. If I attempt to hinder you from fulfilling your priestly obligations, then I myself become unfit as a priest. Measure for measure, breach for breach. We find that the measure always must be the Torah. This root of shaber here, which means a breach, a fracture, a crushing, it comes from the root shabar, which means to break or to bring forth to birth. Once again, reminding us the whole point of this is things are being birthed. Things are coming forth. Things are being changed. The words that we're speaking, the judgments that we're issuing, birth something. There's a ripple effect. Change is going to happen. But does this change cause the body to grow and be sustained, or does this change hinder the body? What do our actions do? It's all about inspecting it. If you break apart this word shaber, it's spelled sheen, beit, resh. The letter sheen means to destroy or to consume. It's attached to the beit resh root, which is a root which means cleanness, pureness. We're reminded that when we cause a breach, we've birthed something that has the potential to disqualify us from the priesthood, and it has the ability to destroy the purity of the body. When I choose to cause a breach in your life, to administer waters the wrong way, to wield the sword the wrong way to the point that it injures you, what I've just done is I've caused the whole purity, the whole clean slate of the entire house now to be compromised. I've affected the whole camp. Yet on the opposite end of the spectrum, we find that this root shaber is connected to the word saber. The only difference is the dot on the sheen. They're cognate words. And this one means hope. It seems quite different than the one that means to destroy something, to crush it, to fracture it. And yet on the opposite end, it can mean hope. How many of you realize that the Hebrew language is always a blessing and a curse? And it will always depend on where we stand in conjunction with it. This word for hope, it indicates a feeling and a conviction that what one wants is going to come to pass if our hope is in Yahweh. In Psalms chapter 146, verse 5, it says, "Happy is he that hath the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope, whose saber is in Yahweh, his God." When we break down this word again, we find that not only can that sheen mean to destroy something, but the sheen itself can mean to purify, to change something, a cleansing fire that'll burn up the dross. And so we find that the purpose, they're being reminded, the whole reason they're charged with this, the whole reason we're supposed to be inspecting the house for blemishes was that it could have a chance to be purified, was to give it an opportunity to make teshuvah, was to give it an opportunity to be cleansed, to be changed, to be made new. It was to give the people of Israel hope. The priests gave hope because they could inspect the individual and let them know that's a blemish. That's going to keep you from walking holy. You need to deal with it. And here's the waters that'll deal with it. Here's the waters that'll cleanse it, make you whole. So now you can come back from this. You can have hope. You can be changed. You can be cleansed. And yet when we use this to cut and to destroy, we find that we give them no hope. Instead, we beat them over the head with it, and they're not allowed. They don't come back. They're not told this can cleanse you. It can purify you. But it's all going to depend on the condition of our heart. It's no accident that these same letters forming this word hope or breach, rearranged, they form the term basar. It means to bear news, to bring tidings, to publish or to show forth, specifically to announce salvation. It also happens to be the root of the word for flesh. They're reminded that when we circumcise our flesh, our basar, it's only then that we can show forth his salvation. We can bear the good news. We can be a vessel that's used to change the body because we're not operating in our own flesh. We're not operating in what we think you should do in your life or what we think you should change because I don't like that. So you need to change that. Instead, we find that we're being used as one that would bring the good news, that would teach them of salvation, that would teach them of Yeshua, teach them how to be changed and purified by him, and we bear hope for the body. We bring hope. We remind them that they can be changed. They can be made new. they can walk holy before him because we're doing it. At the tabernacle, the priests were a constant reminder, you can walk holy before Yahweh. Here's your example. Now let's look at the second part of this measure for measure verse. Blemish for blemish, breach for breach. And then he goes on to say eye for eye and tooth for tooth. When I saw this, I wondered why these particular body parts are mentioned instead of any others. Why not hand for a hand? If I offend you, it's most likely by something I'm doing, which would be represented by my hands. Why not foot for foot, the way I'm walking? And yet he uses eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The word eye is Strong's number 5869. Ayin means eye. The word for tooth is Strong's number 8127. Sheen. It means tooth. How many of you notice that both of these words, not only are they an eye and a tooth, but they happen to be names of Hebrew letters as well? Ayin and Sheen are both Hebrew letters. If you take ayin and sheen and you put ayin and sheen together, it forms a very interesting word in Hebrew. It forms the word ash, Strong's number 6211, which is translated as meaning moth. It refers to a fragile yet destructive insect. In fact, in Job chapter 4:19, we're told, how much less in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, which are crushed before the moth, crushed before the ash, ayin, sheen, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, the moth that crushes those whose foundation is in the dust and who dwells in houses of clay. When we read that verse, we're reminded, what are we made from? Adam was made from the dust of the earth. He's a vessel of clay. And it's the moth that has the potential to destroy the one who's a vessel of clay. It seems then that when he's using this phrase, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, there was a very powerful principle underlying this statement. Our words may seem fragile, yet we're reminded of how destructive they can be. It seems as if there's a hidden warning in this command. When we start down this path and we set this into motion, measure for measure, if we're not careful, it will also set into motion the moth that destroys and crushes those whose foundation is in the dust, the houses of clay. We can only understand how this principle works in the parameters and the guidelines that it's supposed to when we understand this whole idea of what's the dust, what's the afar. Because the moth will destroy those whose foundation is in the dust, in the afar. Well, in Genesis chapter 2, we're told that Yahweh forms man from the dust of the ground, from the afar. And yet, after he forms him from the dust of the ground, he then breathes the breath of life into this body that he has formed. And he calls him Adam. How many of you realize names are powerful, aren't they? It's a prophetical declaration. The interesting thing is that Adam translates as meaning man, and it comes from the root meaning red or blood, dam. And he's immediately connected with the Adamah, the ground. But Adamah is not what he is said to be formed from. Specifically, he uses the word afar. You're formed from the afar. But once the breath was breathed into him, he became associated with the Adamah, the redness, the blood, the bloody one. So we find that Adam is no longer identified with the afar, with the dust, which, by the way, when you begin to look at it, the afar, the dust represents the dead things. It's gray. There's no blood in it. But instead, Adam is prophesied, proclaimed over that he's associated with the blood. The life is in the blood. Adam becomes associated with life, not death. However, after the fall in Genesis chapter 3, we find that there's some more interesting things that begin to happen and be proclaimed concerning the afar, the dust. We find that after the fall, the serpent is commanded that he's going to crawl upon his belly and he's going to eat the dust. He's going to eat the afar, which we know it represents the dead things. He's going to consume the dead things, the dead seed. And Adam is also told a very interesting statement. He's reminded that you're dust. You are afar, and to dust, to afar, you will return. We find that's what's taking place is that there's some boundary lines that are being set up. As long as Adam functions in the role of the Adam, the one with the blood, the one with life, the one that's under the blood covering, the one that's functioning in life, then he has no worries of being consumed by the serpent. He has no worries of being consumed by the moth that destroys the one whose foundation is in the dust, because he's got the blood upon him. He's covered, he's atoned for, he's operating in life. He's bearing the good news of salvation. His flesh has been circumcised. No dead things are operating within him. He has no worries of being consumed. But yet he's warned, the minute you step outside of this position, the minute you cross this boundary line and you begin to contaminate yourself with the dead things, you've now placed yourself in a position to be consumed by the serpent, because to the afar you will return and you'll be consumed. Your foundation becomes the dust of the ground, and before the moth, you're going to be destroyed. And we find this is in connection now with this law, mida keneged mida, measure for measure. The reminder was, I believe, that when you issue judgment from this position, when you have dead things operating in your own life, when you are part of the dust, your foundation is the afar, you're operating from your flesh, and then we choose to mida keneged mida, then we choose to enact measure for measure, we're reminded we're setting into motion our own destruction. Because the same measure we're meting it out is going to be returned to us, and our foundation is in the dust. We're operating with dead things. We're unclean. Our own destruction now gets set into motion, because now we've summoned the serpent, the moth. We're now going to be consumed because there's no covering. Could this be then why the very first command concerning how the priest is to function in this portion was don't touch the dead body? Don't be defiled by the dead? Why? Because he's responsible for judging the blemishes, administering the waters. He's responsible for measure, meting out the judgments of Yahweh. But if he's defiled by the dead body, when he begins to issue forth these judgments, which is what he's supposed to do, he's going to set into motion his own destruction. You realize we see this with Adam? Adam is the high priest. He was supposed to be functioning as Yahweh's high priest in the earth, his representative. He had every right to issue judgment, to handle the waters, to handle the sword. Yet Adam touches the dead body. He eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He messes with the serpent. He now has a blemish. He is now unclean. He's defiled. When Yahweh arrives on the scene and asks Adam, where are you? What's happened? What have you done? The proper response should have been to eat the lechem, shouldn't have? If we have a blemish, eat the bread. The blemishes will be consumed when we eat the lechem, when we put his word in. Cleanse yourself. But Adam doesn't do that, does he? The first thing Adam does is, she made me do it. It's Eve's fault. The first thing Adam does, he's still the high priest. He's operating in this role. The first thing he does is issue judgment on someone else. The moment he issues this judgment upon Eve, upon someone else, his own foundation is the dust. His own self has been contaminated by the dead things. He's touched the dead body. And so now he sets into motion, measure for measure, the moth that consumes the one whose foundation is in the dust, the serpent that consumes the afar. We find that because he himself is defiled by the dead body, he sets into motion his own destruction when he chooses to pass judgment on another. And this becomes the example, if you will, for you and I as well. If we ourselves are contaminated by the dead body, by dead things that we've allowed to be inserted into us, and we then in turn choose to issue judgment on someone else, they did it, look at the spots in them, immediately it sets into motion our own destruction, because our own foundation is in the dust. Let's look at this word for defiled here. The priest is told, do not be defiled for the dead. The word defiled is tameh, Strong's number 2930. It means to be unclean, impure, to defile oneself. The interesting thing, though, is that the first reference of this word tameh is in connection with the defiling of Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. In Genesis 34, verse 5, it says, and Jacob heard that he had defiled tameh, Dinah, his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. Well, we understand, we've already mentioned, names are powerful, names are prophetic. So if we're going to understand this scenario, we need to understand, what does the name Dinah mean? Dinah in Hebrew is Strong's number 1783, and it means judgment. It comes from the root din, to judge, to contend, to plead. You could take out the name Dinah and put in the word judgment, and you'll see the context of what's about to take place. Jacob heard that the judgments of Yahweh were defiled. In other words, things weren't being properly handled. The waters weren't being administered correctly. When we look a little bit closer, we find that after this incident with Dinah, Levi and Simeon decide to kill off all of the city of Shechem. Levi later, now they're the priests. This is who he's talking to in this portion, the descendants of Levi. We find that when we backtrack here, the descendants of Levi were cursed by Jacob because of how they handled this situation. And the reference seems to be that they mishandled the judgments of Yahweh. They did not correctly mete out the waters. We find that they convince all the men of Shechem to circumcise themselves. In other words, the entire city of Shechem acknowledges and chooses to enter into covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's only after they enter into covenant that they then kill them. Could it be then that the warning here is that Levi and all of his descendants after him, and anyone that would operate in the role of the priest in order to rule and reign with Messiah, in order to have dominion, they're being warned, don't commit this same crime, slaughtering those that you enter into covenant with. We find that we defile and we make impure the judgments of Yahweh when we mishandle the way they're carried out. We find that later Levi's redeemed. He's now given the priesthood. Instead of being cursed, he's now redeemed when they learn how to properly administer the judgments after the golden calf. Levi's now chosen. You're going to be the priest. I'll be your portion. There's a reversal. Isn't it interesting, though, that both scenarios dealt with them slaughtering people? They slaughter the entire town of Shechem, and they're cursed for it. They slaughter the children of Israel that were engaged in the golden calf, and they get the priesthood for it. Kind of seems confusing, doesn't it? And so you begin to remember, Levi's responsible. The priesthood is responsible for administering both waters. It's not wrong to cut something off, but you better make sure you're doing it the proper way, measure for measure. Certain things have to be cut off lest the whole body gets destroyed. Certain things cannot be allowed to take place in the camp lest the whole camp's defiled. Levi's responsible for knowing what to cut, when to cut, and how to cut. And we find that in the incident with Shechem, they handled it wrong. The judgments of Yahweh were defiled. They wrongly administered the waters. And it's only when later, when they learn how to properly administer it, that then they can be restored. Let's look at this name Dinah a little closer. Her name is spelled Dalet Yod Nun Hey. The letter Dalet represents the door. It's connected to the Yod Nun Hey root. It forms the word Yonah. We know the name Jonah comes from this same root, and it means dove. In other words, Dinah, her name could literally be translated as the door to the dove. We also understand later that Yeshua becomes connected with this dove, doesn't he? So that, in other words, the door to the Messiah, the door to the dove, the door to Yeshua is defiled and made unclean. When we as priests use our words to slaughter, to harm each other, instead of administering the basar, the good news of salvation. We find that this is what's at stake. When we don't properly function in our role as the priests, we have the potential to defile the door to the Messiah. You're supposed to be an example of how to operate in a relationship with him. That was the job of the priests. There was an intimate relationship between them and Yahweh. They waited upon him. They ministered to Yahweh. And yet, when we don't properly handle this role, we defile the door to him. We've messed up the whole picture. The whole camp now no longer has this image and this teaching tool in front of them of how we're supposed to operate, of how we're to access him. Let's look at the word for dead. Don't be defiled for the dead. The word dead in here is Strong's number 5315, nephesh. It's translated as meaning soul, life, appetite, mind, desire, emotion, a passion, that which breathes the inner being of man. It comes from the root nephash, which means to take breath, to refresh oneself. This is interesting because there's another word for death that means something that's dead, and that's the word mut. And yet this term is not the one that's used here. He doesn't say don't be defiled for that death. Instead, he says don't be defiled for the nephesh, which is often used for life. Man became a living soul, a living nephesh. It's not always connected with death. Mut is the word that is always meaning death, something that's dead. But instead here he uses the term nephesh, which is more often used for life and breath of life. So the question becomes, what really defiles us then? The breath does. What goes in? The breath that goes in, if it's anything other than the word, the breath of Yahweh, and then the breath that then comes out, our words, what we speak forth, becomes what has the potential to defile us. When he's speaking to the priest, if you put in these definitions, it could literally have told them, don't be defiled, don't be unclean by the words that are coming out of your mouth. Because it's these words that you're speaking forth, it's how you're administering the waters, whether bitter or cleansing. It's the words that we speak forth, and it's how we're handling and wielding the sword of the word of Yahweh. Do not be defiled by the words that come out of your mouth, because it's the duty of the one that handles the tabernacle to know that. You're handling the presence of Yahweh. Don't defile my judgments like Levi and Simeon did. Isn't it interesting that Simeon in Hebrew, Shemon, it's connected to the root Shema. It means to hear, to be obedient. But yet his word, his name has the noon suffix on the end, which means to diminish, to make small. His hearing was diminished. His obedience was diminished. And when that happened, they defiled the judgments of Yahweh because they weren't properly hearing anyway. It wasn't being put in. The lechem wasn't being put in. So what came out defiled instead of purified. Now we can better understand the connections with the bread. We have a blemish and are unable to operate as the priest. We must eat the bread. We have to allow his word to claim space within us because it circumcises our own hearts. It removes the dead things that have caused us to become unclean, because it's only when we put in his lechem, in his word, that what comes out of us, our words, our nephesh, it changes. And instead of being something that defiles and hinders the body, it becomes something that cleanses. It becomes the breath of life. What did Yeshua do to his disciples? He breathed upon them. They're given a clean slate. This goes in, so now that what comes out of their mouth will also be clean, and it becomes a ripple effect. He breathes on his disciples, and his disciples now are to go and breathe on others. And the words, the breath that comes out of them will now cleanse even more. And it becomes this ripple effect that begins to affect the nations. This is why the disciples, I believe, were told, greater things than you're going to do. Why? Because it's a multiplication process. I breathed on you, and now you in turn go and breathe on others, and it continues to multiply and multiply. But if our nephesh that's coming out is not the breath of life, if our words have become contaminated by the dead things, it stops it. It severs the whole process. Do you realize that the same solution was told to Adam as well? Eat the bread. After he's compromised the role of the priest and he's unfit to operate in this function, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, he's told by Yahweh, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. When we see this statement, it seems to be inferring that maybe as long as he's working in the sweat of his face and getting this bread, he won't return unto the dust. But the moment he stops seeking the bread, the moment he stops toiling and putting that bread in, he returns to the dust where he can be consumed by the serpent. The word sweat here, in the sweat of thy face, you're going to eat the bread. The word sweat is Strong's number 2188, zeah, and it means sweat. But if you look at the way it's spelled Zion, ayin, hey. It contains that root zay, meaning lamb, Zion, hey. And within the middle of the word lamb, you have inserted the ayin, which means to see, to understand, to know. Adam was told, if you work the ground, you will see and understand the lamb. You will see and understand the Messiah, the very one that's going to cause you to be Adam, the one who's blooded. Adam literally could mean, I will blood you. But if he doesn't work the ground, he'll never see the Messiah. He'll never understand him. He'll never perceive him. And therefore, he'll return to the dust. He won't have the covering. He won't have the blood in his face. He'll be afar, a dead thing. In other words, Adam was being given the clue of how to have access to the door of life. You're being cut off from the tree. You're not going to be able to eat of this. You're being removed from the garden, removed from the tabernacle, because you're no longer fit to operate in the role of the priest. But if you'll work this ground, if you'll eat this bread, then you can have access to life again. We find that the moment we cease to access this door, the moment we cease to till the ground for the bread, we return to the dust. We become contaminated by the dead things. We're a vessel. You're going to be filled with something. If we're not being filled with his lechem, with his bread, the serpent is right there to oblige you and to fill you with something else. Touch the dead body and we're contaminated. We find that the job of the priest was always to point towards the door, to show the nation of Israel and to remind all the other nations as well, this is how you can access life. This is how you can be changed and purified. But with that same responsibility, they were reminded, you've got to keep the dead things from making the entire camp unclean. They're responsible for understanding and discerning what needs to be cut off and what can be allowed to stay. We find that the problems arise when we're not willing to first apply the sword to our own hearts before inspecting the rest of the camp. And so we find as we get ready to close, we're in the midst of the counting of the Omer, aren't we? Isn't it interesting that Omer in Hebrew is related to Emor, to speak, to say, to count the words? We're reminded during this time of the counting of the Omer that it's by inspecting first our own hearts that we're able to be used as a vessel that administers his waters unto others. Measure for measure. Midah kineged midah. If it's the Torah that's our measurement, though, then no one can argue, can we? Because we've all agreed this is the standard. I administered this, measure for measure, and it's administered back to me. And constantly we're reminded this is the door. This is how we access life. This is what keeps us from the dust. Don't be contaminated by the dead thing. Instead, allow the cleansing waters to remove the blemishes. Amen? Well, we hope you have enjoyed, and thank you for listening. And hopefully now as we begin to go through this counting of the Omer, we're constantly reminded, allow the cleansing process to take place. Remove the blemishes.